Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk hums with fluorescent lights and the sharp bite of antiseptic at 0200 hours. Laura Bennett moves through the surgical ICU with the economy of someone who's worked in darker places, no wasted steps, no unnecessary motion, no presence that announces itself. The night shift suits her. Everyone else is sleeping. The ones who need her most are awake. She checks vitals on the post-op patients in beds 4 through 7, her movements precise as a surgical instrument. Temperature stable. O2 saturation holding at 94%. The 4 drip on bed 6 is running at the correct rate, she adjusts it anyway, the kind of small correction that separates competent nurses from excellent ones. The tremor in her left fingers comes when she's tired, the nerves never quite healed after 18 years, but her hands are steady. Always steady. She's held people together in places where steady was the only thing standing between life and a body bag. The unit is quiet in that particular way that precedes crisis, the kind of silence that feels like holding your breath. Monitors beep their rhythmic reassurance. The ventilator in bed 3 wheezed its mechanical rhythm, a sound Laura has heard 10,000 times in 1,000 different rooms. She doesn't flinch at it anymore. Flinching is a luxury for people who've only worked in peacetime. At 0247, the overhead speaker crackles. Not the standard unit page. The all-call. Trauma activation. Level 1. ETA for minutes. 28-year-old male, training accident, shrapnel wounds, left thorax and left lower extremity. Notify Dr. Caldwell immediately. Laura's hands pause for exactly 1 second. She knows that code. 0247, the specific time will matter later, though she doesn't know that yet. She finishes documenting the vitals on bed 7, sets the pen down with deliberate precision, and moves toward the supply room without rushing. Rushing is how mistakes happen. She's never made mistakes when it counted. By the time the ambulance doors burst open 8 minutes later, she's already laid out the equipment. 2 sets of sterile gloves. The trauma shears with the call sign engraved along the blade, Valkyrie, tucked into her front pocket beneath her scrubs, a weight she's carried for a decade. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, against her ribs, a secret she'll carry to her grave if it comes to that. The scar tissue on her forearms catches the fluorescent light when she reaches across the stretcher. The patient is conscious. Young. Dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. His left side is wrapped in emergency dressings already soaked through with blood the color of rust. The EMT is calling out vitals in the practice monotone of someone who's done this 300 times and is about to do it again. BP 102/68 and dropping. Heart rate 124. Respiratory rate 28. 2 large bore lines established. O2 running. No sign of tension pneumo on field assessment, but we've got palpable crepitus on the left side indicating possible. Bring him to Trauma 1, a voice cuts through the controlled chaos. Laura turns. She already knew who it would be. Dr. Raymond Caldwell strides into the bay like a man who owns the floor he walks on. 73 years old, still sharp enough to be dangerous, the kind of surgeon who built his reputation on being the smartest person in every room and has spent the last 2 decades making sure everyone knows it. His posture is surgical, shoulders back, chin forward, the physical manifestation of a man who expects obedience the way other people expect gravity. Laura feels something shift in her chest that she recognizes and immediately suppresses. The patient's eyes lock onto Caldwell with the kind of desperation that comes from bleeding out and knowing it. Laura turns away slightly, positioning herself to start the cut-down protocol on the left arm, already knowing Caldwell won't need her suggestion because she won't offer it. I've got 2 lines, the EMT says. I'll need 6, Caldwell says, not to the EMT, but to the room generally, the way you might announce that you require air to breathe. Laura, get me a central line kit and the rapid infuser. We're going straight to OR if his pressures don't stabilize in the next 3 minutes. Not 4. 3. She's already moving before he finishes speaking. The central line kit is in the 3rd drawer of the trauma cart, exactly where it should be, assembled 23 minutes ago when she arrived for her shift. The rapid infuser sits on the shelf above it. She carries both to the bedside, sets them down where Caldwell can reach without asking for them again. The patient is watching her now. She meets his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to communicate that he's in the right hands, that everything that's about to happen is intentional and purposeful. She doesn't smile. Smiling is for people who aren't about to watch someone's chest get opened. She just looks at him with a kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, and she sees something shift in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or just the recognition that she knows what she's doing. Prep the left side, Caldwell says. Full sterile field. I want X-ray and ultrasound set up simultaneously. If there's shrapnel embedded near the left main bronchus, we're not waiting for radiology interpretation. Laura is already unrolling the sterile drape with one hand while starting the skin prep with the other. Chlorhexidine in broad strokes. The smell of it, that sharp medicinal bite, fills the small space. Her movements are economical. Everything in sequence. Everything necessary. The patient's name tag says Commander J. Hartley, United States Navy. That should mean nothing to her. She should not recognize the name from the letters her son Marcus sent home 3 months ago, short notes that arrived between long deployments, each one beginning with "Mom, my commanding officer is a good man. I wanted you to know that. His name is Commander Hartley. He's the reason I'm still here. He led us out of Sanjin Valley when the whole valley wanted us dead. If anything happens to me, you should know that I had someone watching my back." She does recognize the name. Of course she does. She reads every letter twice, then burns them in the bathroom sink. The central line goes in smooth. Caldwell's hands move with the precision of someone who's done this procedure exactly 4,000 times, and she knows this because she's been watching him work for 3 years and she counts everything. His technique is sound. His bedside manner is a weapon designed to ensure that everyone knows he is the authority, the decision-maker, the only person in the room who matters. By 03:12, Commander Hartley's vitals have stabilized enough that he's not actively dying, which in trauma is the highest compliment you can pay. BP climbing. O2 holding at 88%. Heart rate coming down. The shrapnel in his left thorax will need to come out in the OR, but the OR can wait another 5 minutes because the patient isn't coding, and in those 5 minutes, Caldwell can establish complete control over the narrative of what happens next. "Good work, people," Caldwell says to the room, which is his way of dismissing them. The EMTs file out. The junior residents shuffle back to their positions. The respiratory tech checks the ventilator one more time and steps away. Laura begins breaking down the trauma equipment. The gloves come off, snap snap, the sound like gunshots in the sudden quiet. The dressings get bagged. The unused instruments get collected for sterilization. She moves through the cleanup with the same precision she brought to the setup because, in her experience, the difference between a good outcome and a bad one often comes down to someone paying attention to the details no one else notices. Caldwell watches her work. She can feel it the way you feel eyes on your back in dark hallways. A moment passes where the room feels smaller. He's calculating something, the way men who've built empires on authority always calculate. He's looking at her competence and deciding what it means for his. "Prepare him for OR transfer," Caldwell says. And someone should probably call his next of kin. Family should be here when he wakes up. Assuming he wakes up. It's not a prediction. It's a fact delivered as a threat, the kind of thing men say when they want everyone to understand that only they can prevent disaster. Only they matter. Laura finishes organizing the cart, double-checks that nothing is missing, and then she pulls the trauma shears from her pocket to trim a piece of tape that's peeling up from the monitor lead. The blade catches the light. The engraving glints. Valkyrie. Caldwell is still watching. He doesn't see the hands that held a tourniquet on a Marine's leg at 0400 in Helmand Province while mortars fell like rain. He doesn't see the woman who packed a sucking chest wound with the wrapper from an MRE and her own fingers while the rest of her team died around her. He doesn't see the legend who walked 32 dying Marines out of hell and then got erased from existence because the Pentagon decided she'd seen things that couldn't exist in the official record. He sees a nurse named Laura Bennett who works night shifts that nobody else wants, who's been here 3 years, who apparently knows how to follow orders. He sees competence, and competence, in his world, is competition. The next words out of his mouth are quiet enough that only she hears them. Don't develop any ideas about protocol, Laura. This case is mine. Everything about this case is mine. Clear. She meets his eyes. Her voice, when she answers, carries no inflection at all. Crystal clear, Doctor. The night shift moved like clockwork, for hours in, Commander Hartley stable, vitals holding steady at 94 oxygen saturation, heart rate steady in the low 80s. Laura checked the monitors at 2:06 a.m., her movements economical, her eyes reading the screens like sheet music. The intercom crackled softly with routine pages. Normal. Quiet. The kind of shift where bad things didn't announce themselves. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 3:15 a.m. for rounds, moving through the recovery wing like he owned the building, and he nearly did, chief of surgery with 23 years of unchallenged authority and a reputation for punishing any nurse who questioned his orders. He had the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, voices dropping to whispers when he entered a room. 3 residents trailed behind him like satellites, notebooks open, ready to transcribe his pronouncements as if they were scripture. Laura stood at the medication cart when she heard his voice. Hartley's renal panel shows elevated creatinine. Start him on ampicillin, double dose, for push every 6 hours. He said it without checking the chart, the words delivered with the finality of someone unaccustomed to contradiction. Laura looked at the medication order. Then at Hartley's chart. Then back at the order. Ampicillin in a patient with compromised kidney function. The medication wouldn't clear properly, would accumulate, would cause acute tubular necrosis. The protocol had changed in September. She'd memorized it because that's what good nurses did. They knew the things doctors forgot to know. She turned toward Caldwell. The residents were already writing. Doctor. Her voice came out steady, conversational. The renal protocol changed last month for patients with elevated creatinine. Ampicillin accumulates. Cefotaxime would clear better. The pen stopped moving. One of the residents looked up. Another held his breath. Caldwell turned to face her with the slowness of a predator recognizing movement in tall grass. His eyes were blue and absolutely devoid of warmth. When he smiled, it was a shark smile, all teeth, no kindness. Nurse Bennett, I wasn't aware you'd completed medical school since yesterday. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a tone that somehow carried further than a shout. Please enlighten us. Where exactly did you earn your MD? The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Laura did not look away. She did not shift her weight. She did not apologize. She took one measured breath and let the silence stretch for 3 seconds. The dosage protocol changed last month for renal patients, Doctor. His jaw clenched. She saw it happen, that small betrayal of his absolute control, the microscopic failure of his mask. He wasn't accustomed to being corrected. He wasn't accustomed to being right-checked by someone with RN after her name instead of MD. I'll be sure to consult you next time I need nursing advice. He turned away, and she heard him change the order, not to cefotaxime, but to another antibiotic, one that would work, because he was competent even when he was vengeful. That was what made him dangerous. He could punish her and still practice excellent medicine. The residents walked away, and she felt their eyes sliding off her like water off oil. By morning, the real campaign began. Commander Hartley's room at 8:02 a.m. was small and beige and utterly quiet except for the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze and the monitor's steady beep. Laura changed his dressing with practiced efficiency, her hands moving like they belonged to someone else, independent of thought, the trauma shears hanging from her scrub pocket catching the fluorescent light. She'd learned to compartmentalize years ago, The hand that held the gauze was separate from the mind that remembered Helmand, the fingers that taped the dressing separate from the memories of 32 Marines and a sandstorm and the sound of incoming fire that stopped when she made it stop. She didn't see Caldwell until he was already in the room, didn't see him because she wasn't looking for danger from inside her own hospital. "Nurse Bennett, a word." He said it like it wasn't a request. Rebecca Hartley looked up from the bedside chair, and Commander Hartley's eyes followed her movements with sudden intensity, like he'd just recognized something. Their daughter Samantha was there too, 17 and uncomfortable, sitting near the window as if she could make herself smaller by proximity to the glass. Caldwell paced like a prosecutor building a case. "You questioned my clinical judgment last night. In front of residents. In front of a chart that I had reviewed and you had not. Doctor, the protocol. You don't get to interrupt me. You're a nurse. Your job is to execute orders, not critique them." He turned toward Rebecca Hartley, his voice shifting to the tone one uses when acknowledging an audience. This is precisely the problem with nursing education these days. They teach critical thinking instead of obedience. He turned back to Laura, and she saw his lips curve upward, that smile again, the one that belonged to predators. "Nurse Nightingale, let me explain something. I graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School. I completed a 5-year surgical fellowship. I have published 43 peer-reviewed papers on trauma care. You completed a 4-year nursing program. That means I have 6 additional years of training. 6 years. And you think you know better than I do?" The room had gone quiet. Even the ventilator seemed quieter. Laura felt the words like hands pressing down on her sternum, felt the weight of them settling across her shoulders, insubordination, questioning authority, a nurse who didn't know her place in the hierarchy. Rebecca Hartley wasn't looking at her anymore, was looking away with that particular embarrassment people showed when they witnessed someone else's humiliation, the discomfort of proximity to another person's shame. But Laura Bennett had been trained by people who understood pain as data, who'd learned in Helmand Province that composure under fire was the difference between people who lived and people who didn't. She didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. A single tear escaped, just one, the kind that slipped out before the body understood the order to suppress it, and she wiped it without breaking eye contact, her eyes meeting Caldwell's for the 2 seconds it took to erase the evidence. "I will continue to put patients first, Dr. Caldwell, regardless of the cost to myself." His jaw went tight. She saw his fingers curl into fists at his sides. Samantha Hartley had stopped texting on her phone and was staring at Laura with an expression of profound recognition, the way young people sometimes look when they see courage and don't yet understand that courage is just another word for having nothing left to lose. Caldwell left the room without another word. Commander Hartley's eyes followed him to the door, then returned to Laura's face. She didn't meet his gaze. She kept her hands on the dressing, kept them steady, and didn't ask herself why a Navy commander was studying her with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle they didn't quite have all the pieces for. The next day, Laura sat down at 12:24 p.m. in the break room with her lunch tray, turkey sandwich, apple, 8 ounces of Greek yogurt, the careful choices of someone who'd learned that food was fuel, nothing more. The room was half full. For nurses at a table near the window, 2 residents arguing about a case near the coffee station, someone's abandoned phone playing music from a speaker. She opened her yogurt. The spoon clicked against the plastic cup. One of the nurses, Patricia, who'd been friendly during the first 3 weeks, stood up. "Oh, I forgot I needed to catch Dr. Miley about that medication allergy." She was already gathering her things, already moving away. Then the second nurse. Then the third. The residents who'd been arguing suddenly needed coffee from the cafeteria on the 2nd floor, the kind of coffee that apparently wasn't available up here despite the full coffee station currently running behind Laura's chair. Their movements were synchronized, choreographed, the kind of deliberate exodus that couldn't possibly be accidental. 30 seconds later, Laura was alone. The break room fluorescent lights buzzed their insect hum. Somewhere down the hall, a code team was moving fast, their footsteps an urgent staccato on the linoleum. Laura opened her sandwich and ate it anyway, her eyes on the wall, her face a smooth mask of complete indifference. She'd sat in much worse silence. She'd sat in the silence of Helmand, in forward operating bases surrounded by people who didn't know who she really was, in convoy trucks filled with Marines who treated her like a NCO and not like a major. This break room silence was nothing. She finished her lunch in the quiet. Then she went back to work. By Friday, the write-up appeared on the unit board where everyone could see it, laminated and official and damning. Disciplinary action, Eld Bennett. Insubordination and failure to respect chain of command. The charge nurse who'd been friendly, the one who'd told Laura she had good instincts during week 2, the one who'd invited her to lunch before this all started, wouldn't meet her eyes when Laura saw her reading it. Caldwell had been systematic. Professional. He'd documented everything, had recorded the time of the correction, had listed witnesses, had written a summary of her actions that made her sound like a threat to patient safety instead of the person who'd prevented that threat. He'd built it carefully, strategically, the way someone builds a case against an enemy they intend to destroy completely. Laura read the write-up once. Then she took a photograph of it with her phone, documentation, insurance, habit, and walked away. She clocked in for her shift 30 minutes later. The unit had changed. Her usual support staff had been reassigned. Her patient loads had shifted. The medication protocols for Commander Hartley's care had been revised, now requiring double authorization for anything beyond basic wound care. Caldwell was cutting her access, restricting her movement, building walls between her and the patients she was responsible for. She went to work anyway. That night, while changing Hartley's dressings, the protocol now required 2 signatures before she could even access certain supplies, before she could do the basic work of keeping a wound clean and free of infection. The commander watched her hands move with an intensity that went beyond normal patient observation. His eyes tracked each movement, studied the way she worked, the way she didn't use unnecessary gestures, the economy of movement that came from training. "You're military," he said quietly. Not a question. Laura didn't pause. Her hands continued their work, steady and sure. "No, sir. You move like someone who's taken basic combatives training. Your hands, they've held weapons. Recently. I think you're reading too much into body language, Commander." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My daughter noticed something. The way you responded to Caldwell yesterday. She said you moved like someone used to taking fire without flinching." Laura finished taping the dressing. She stepped back, checked the wound one more time, and made notes on his chart. She didn't answer him because the safest answer was silence, and silence was a skill she'd perfected over years of pretending to be less than what she was. But Hartley's eyes didn't leave her face, and she felt something shift in the room, a recognition, a question mark hanging in the fluorescent light. She finished her rounds and clocked out at 6:45 a.m., driving through Norfolk in the grey pre-dawn, the city still asleep, the streets empty except for early shift workers heading toward places that mattered. She went home to her apartment, 3 rooms and a shower, and sat in the dark with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold an hour ago. The unit patch was sewn into her jacket lining, hidden where no one would find it, faded now, the colors nearly gone, the emblem barely visible. She hadn't looked at it in years. She didn't look at it now. The shift started with the schedule posted on the break room bulletin board. Laura's eyes found her name in the new rotation Caldwell had approved overnight. Recovery Wing. Solo coverage. 12-hour shift beginning at 7 a.m. She read it twice, processing not the words but the mathematics underneath them. Recovery was the furthest wing from surgical support, from backup, from any colleague who might witness what happened next. The night before, her assignment had been surgical recovery with 2 other nurses rotating breaks. Now it was just her. Caldwell had redistributed the staff with surgical precision. Martinez to the cardiac unit. Yolanda to pediatrics. Thompson to the ER. Each nurse reassigned with a written justification, staffing needs, unit balance, optimal resource allocation. All of it plausible. All of it designed to leave her alone. She arrived at 6:45 a.m., 20 minutes early, the way she always did. The morning air in Norfolk carried salt from the harbour and the smell of diesel from the Navy ships docked at the naval station. The hospital's glass doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, and she moved through the lobby toward the locker room, her scrubs already on, already ready. The badge clipped to her pocket had no rank, no title that mattered. Just her name. Just a nurse. The locker room was empty. She'd expected that too. The recovery wing occupied the third floor's east corridor, a long sequence of monitored beds separated by fabric dividers. Most patients post-op, still climbing out of anesthesia, monitors beeping their steady rhythm into the fluorescent-lit air. 12 beds. 12 patients. 1 nurse. No CNA, no tech, no backup. The recovery wing supervisor, Patricia, passed the assignment sheet across the desk without meeting her eyes. "You're good for recovery today," Patricia said. It wasn't a question. "Understood," Laura replied. Patricia's jaw tightened. She looked like she wanted to say more but didn't. That was worse somehow, the silence of people who knew what was happening and had decided their own job security mattered more than her survival. The morning passed in controlled chaos. Post-op patients needed monitoring every 15 minutes, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, pain levels, dressing checks. A patient in bed 4 was experiencing nausea. She held the basin and spoke in the calm voice that had steadied dying men in Helmand, and the patient's breathing normalized. Bed 7 had a line infiltration. She repositioned the 4 with the kind of precision that came from inserting central lines in combat conditions, hands moving on their own, muscle memory taking over. Bed 10 needed assessment before discharge. She walked through the checklist with the kind of thoroughness that made the patient's daughter ask for her by name when it was time to leave. By 9 a.m., the pattern was clear. Caldwell had orchestrated more than just staff redistribution. He'd restructured the entire schedule. A memo on her phone from unit management confirmed it. Due to ongoing operational needs, Ms. Bennett would continue solo recovery assignments through the end of the month. No specified end date. No rotation back to surgical support. Just week after week of her alone, visible to no one who might advocate for her, isolated in a wing where her competence would go unwitnessed and her failures would be completely her responsibility. She didn't react to the memo. She read it, understood it, and clipped her badge back to her pocket. By 10:15, a patient in bed 2 began showing signs of something wrong. The monitor showed increasing heart rate from 88 to 92 to 97. His blood pressure was holding, but his oxygen saturation was drifting downward. 89. 87. 85. She'd seen this pattern before in Marines coming out of anesthesia, subtle internal bleeding, the body's systems beginning to fail before the obvious signs appeared. She called for Dr. Patterson, the recovery room physician, but got his nurse saying he was in surgery. She left a message marked urgent and stayed at the bedside, monitoring, watching, waiting for the escalation that hadn't happened yet but would. The wait itself was the strategy. Caldwell hadn't just isolated her from staff. He'd isolated her from help. By the time actual backup arrived, something catastrophic might have already occurred. And when it did, who would be standing there alone? Who would the system blame? She didn't flinch at the calculation. She'd learned in Helmand that the best strategy was always to plan for the worst and execute with composure. She pulled up the patient's preoperative report on the hospital computer, 63-year-old male, appendectomy, anesthesia time 42 minutes, no significant blood loss noted. The surgeon had documented normal closure, normal counts, normal everything. But the body didn't always cooperate with the documentation. At 10:40, the patient's saturation dropped to 83. She increased the oxygen flow, repositioned his head, checked the nasal cannula for kinks. The saturation crept back to 86 but wouldn't climb higher. His heart rate was now 104. Still compensating. Still stable. But running out of time. Dr. Patterson emerged from surgery at 11:03. She caught him before he could pass the recovery wing entirely, intercepting him with the kind of quiet authority that made him stop despite his obvious irritation at being delayed. "Bed 2, she said. "Vitals trending downward since 10:15. HR 104. O2 sat in the low 80s. Something's bleeding internally. Patterson looked annoyed at the interruption. Did you run labs? No orders written. I called your nurse at 10:20. He moved into the room anyway and examined the patient. Laura stood at the foot of the bed, watching his face change as he recognized what she'd already recognized. Internal bleeding. Possible hemorrhage. The patient needed to go back to the OR. Get him prepped for return to surgery, Patterson said. I'll call the OR team. She nodded and turned away, beginning the discharge process, disconnecting monitors, documenting vitals, preparing the stretcher. This was what competence looked like when no one was watching. This was what it meant to be invisible and indispensable at the same time. But that wasn't the worst part. At noon, just as the patient was being transported back upstairs and the recovery wing had momentarily cleared for the shift change, her phone buzzed with a text from the schedule management system. A new notification. Another rotation adjustment. She opened it and read the new assignment structure. Laura Bennett would continue solo recovery coverage indefinitely, with additional weekend shifts added to her rotation. The memo was signed by Dr. Caldwell himself and CC'd to Human Resources. Indefinite. That was the word that hung in the fluorescent-lit air like a surgical instrument waiting to cut. She didn't show the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the trained response of someone who'd learned that reaction was a luxury she couldn't afford. She texted back an acknowledgement, just understood, and returned to her rounds. The rest of the shift passed in the same steady rhythm. Monitors beeping. Patients waking. Dressings checked. Pain managed. She was still the only nurse in recovery, the only person responsible for 12 beds and 1,000 potential complications, and she moved through it all with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. Her hand stayed steady. Her voice stayed level. Her eyes stayed focused on the screens, on the patients, on the work that still needed doing regardless of who was watching or not watching. At 3 p.m., as the evening shift nurses began arriving, Patricia reappeared at the desk and finally met Laura's eyes. There was something there, pity, maybe. Or recognition of something she didn't want to acknowledge. You good? Patricia asked. I'm good, Laura replied. And she meant it. She was more than good. She was exactly where Caldwell had positioned her to fail, and she was still working, still solving, still saving people who would never know they'd been saved by someone in a corner of the hospital where no one was watching. The quiet person in the room was holding it all together. And no one had any idea. The dressing change was supposed to take 8 minutes. Routine. A simple wound evaluation, fresh gauze, antibiotics, and back to recovery protocol. Commander Hartley was doing well, vitals stable, infection markers dropping, the kind of patient who makes nurses feel like medicine actually works. Laura had changed his dressing 17 times in 3 days. She knew every centimeter of that chest wound, the precise angle where the shrapnel had entered, the way the tissue was knitting back together in careful, deliberate layers. She was alone in the room. That was the first thing she noticed as she pulled the old gauze away. Usually there was a tech, an LPN, someone. The schedule Caldwell had implemented 2 weeks ago, the one that looked random on paper but wasn't, meant Laura worked critical recovery cases without backup. It was a perfect setup. If something went wrong, there would be no witnesses. There would only be negligence. The moment she lifted the final layer of gauze, she knew. The wound wasn't closing. It was opening. The suture line along the inferior edge had dehisced, separated completely, and underneath was the arterial bleed Caldwell had missed on rounds. A small bleed, hidden by the swelling, the kind of thing that wouldn't show until pressure changed. Until someone disturbed it. Blood pooled against her gloved fingers. Not fast. Not yet. But real. Arterial blood moves like liquid in tension. Laura's hands didn't hesitate. Her voice didn't shake when she hit the call button, once, brief, no panic. I need supplies to room for 12. Now. She kept pressure on the wound with her left hand while her right reached for the meal tray beside the bed. The plastic wrap covering the untouched Salisbury steak. She knew she had 90 seconds before the bleeding accelerated, maybe 2 minutes before Hartley's blood pressure started dropping. The artery was small but significant. The math was simple. A 2 mm arterial leak at systolic pressure loses approximately 400 milliliters per minute once the tamponade pressure of the surrounding tissue is lost. Hartley's eyes fluttered open. What's? Don't move. Don't speak. Breathe slow. Her voice was different now. Not the deferential surgical nurse. The cadence of someone who'd held people together in places where hospitals were rubble and the only pharmacy was what you carried in your pack. She wrapped the plastic tightly around the wound, creating a seal, then placed her right hand over it, pressing with the heel of her palm against the sternum. Direct pressure. 8 minutes. She'd done this before. In Helmand. In a convoy truck with no power, no monitors, nothing but her hands and the knowledge that if she moved, this Marine died. His name was Torres then. His name was Hartley now. The monitor beside the bed began to show the stress. Heart rate climbing. 94, 110. 127, his blood pressure was compensating, but it wouldn't hold. Not for long. She didn't look at the clock. She didn't count seconds. Muscle memory wasn't about time, it was about reading the body, about feeling the exact moment compensation began to fail. The sweat beading on his forehead. The slight grey tint creeping into his lips. The way his hands curled into fists against the mattress. 5 minutes. The door burst open. 2 nurses and a tech, finally, because someone in the hallway had heard the tension in her voice. They saw what was happening and moved without questions. One started and 4 in his left arm. The other grabbed the crash cart. Laura didn't move her hands. "Talk to me," the charge nurse said. Her name was Diana. She'd avoided Laura in the break room for 2 weeks like proximity was contagious. Dehisced suture line, arterial bleeding, 8 minutes direct pressure. Needs surgical intervention. Every word precise. Clinical. Nothing personal. Nothing uncertain. 6 minutes. Code activation. Diana was already moving. Negative. Not yet. Pressure's holding. 7 minutes. The tech was running fluid, pushing fluid, getting blood from the bank. Hartley's breathing was shallow now, his body understanding before his conscious mind could follow, he was losing volume. The body knows. The body always knows. 8 minutes. The surgical team hit the room like a controlled explosion. Dr. Reynolds, the senior surgeon, not Caldwell. 3 residents. A perfusionist. The kind of cavalry that arrives when someone on the floor knows how to ask for help without sounding panicked. Full dehiscence, arterial, Laura reported, stepping back but keeping pressure until Reynolds could scrub in. 14 minutes of significant bleed. Vitals compensating but trending down. 2 units running, typo in the warmer. Reynolds glanced at her once. A real glance. The kind surgeons give nurses who know what they're seeing. Then the door swung open again. Dr. Caldwell stood in the frame like he'd been waiting just outside, watching. Waiting for this. His eyes moved from Laura to Hartley to the blood on her gloves to the plastic wrap, now soaked dark red. His expression changed, not surprise. Recognition. Like he was seeing something he'd already calculated. "Step away from the patient," Caldwell said. His voice was quiet. That made it worse. "We've got arterial bleed," Reynolds said, not looking up. "I need her documentation on the wound status." "Step away from the patient, Major Bennett," he said it like he'd been practicing. Like he knew exactly who she was and what that title meant. "You're done here." The room froze. Not a long freeze. A second, maybe 2. But in that second, everything changed. Reynolds's hand stilled. The resident's expression shifted from focused to confused. Diana's head turned. "Dr. Caldwell, we need," Reynolds tried. "I'm suspending her, effective immediately, for performing procedures beyond her scope of practice and endangering this patient. Her judgment is impaired. Her license is compromised." Caldwell didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He was standing in the only exit. "Security is on the way." Laura pulled her gloves off. Slowly. She dropped them in the biohazard. She placed her stethoscope on the supply cart with the same care a soldier removes a weapon. Her hands were steady. They didn't tremble. The tremor was in her left shoulder, tiny and invisible, the kind of thing only she would feel. She walked out between the two security guards who arrived as she finished. One on each side. Not touching her. Just presence. Just authority. The entire recovery ward watched, nurses stopping mid-task, patients' eyes following, families in doorways going quiet as she passed. Behind her, Reynolds's voice, "Get me the surgical log. I want to know every person who touched this patient." In the administrative wing, Caldwell made her watch while he built her destruction. His office door was open. She could see him through the glass as she sat at the table, signing suspension paperwork, her signature steady and controlled. He was on the phone. Pattern of insubordination, made independent medical decisions without consultation, liability nightmare. "I'm recommending termination for cause." He paused. Listened. "Yes, I understand the optics. But her behavior endangers the entire institution." That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was 2 hours later, in the parking garage, sitting in her car with the engine dead and the keys in her hand. The rain had started, Norfolk rain, thick and grey and cold, the kind that sounds like static on the windshield. Through the concrete pillars, she could see Caldwell's office light. Still on. Still working. Building the paper trail that would erase her from medicine the way the Pentagon had erased her from history. Disappeared twice. Her left hand shook first. Then her right. Not fear. Not quite. The kind of tremor that comes when you've held pressure for 8 minutes and then suddenly let go, and your body realizes it's finished, and every muscle that was locked in place turns liquid. She couldn't turn the key. She tried. Her hand moved toward the ignition and wouldn't complete the motion. Outside, rain hammered the windshield like someone was asking to get in. The next morning, her phone rang at 6:44 a.m. Hospital administration. Report to the CEO's office immediately. Termination proceeding. She didn't shower. She didn't change. She drove in the same scrubs from yesterday, the ones with Hartley's blood-dried brown on the cuff, autopilot all the way. The elevator climbed. Her heart rate stayed controlled. The hallway on the administrative level was white and quiet and full of the kind of silence that comes before verdict. She pushed the office door open. The room was crowded. Commander Hartley sat in a wheelchair, shoulders still wrapped but eyes clear and sharp and grateful. A Navy SEAL in dress uniform stood against the far wall, decorated chest, the kind of presence that makes space rearrange around it. 2 FBI agents in dark suits. And standing near the windows, still in his marine dress blues, hair military short, the same green eye she'd given him 16 years ago. Marcus. Her son. Caldwell was in the corner, pale, sweating through his shirt collar. Hartley's voice came out weak but clear, "Valkyrie." The room went so completely silent you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz. Laura felt her knees buckle. Not from fear. From recognition. From a call sign she'd buried with Operation Copper Dawn, a call sign that was supposed to stay classified, stay hidden, stay dead. Valkyrie. The angels of death. The women who walked into fire and carried the dying out. Marcus stepped forward. His hands were shaking. His voice broke like he was 16 again, not a Marine. "Mom, they told me Major Laura Bennett died in Helmand. They told me you were gone." An FBI agent stepped forward holding a manila folder. Mark declassified. Her hand shook as she opened it. Her hand shook as she opened it. Pages and pages. Date stamped across the top in red ink, declassified. Operation Copper Dawn. Helmand Province. 32 Marines extracted under fire. One medical officer who'd refused to leave the landing zone until every wounded soldier was loaded. One Major Laura Bennett who'd held a tourniquet for 43 minutes straight while rounds punched through the fuselage of the MH-6 Little Bird above her head. She couldn't read past the first page. Not here. Not in front of them. Marcus moved closer. His uniform was dress blues, the kind you wore when the Pentagon called in the middle of the night and said be ready in 4 hours. His voice came out rough, like something had scraped it raw from the inside. They told me you died, Mom. They said it in a briefing. They showed me a photograph of a body bag and they said Major Laura Bennett was killed in action, classified detail, end of story. I was 14 years old and I asked to see your burial site and they said there is no site, it never happened, your mother doesn't exist anymore. I spent 8 years believing you were dead. The room didn't move. Even the ventilation system seemed to hold its breath. She set the file down on the table with both hands flat, pressed hard against the wood like it might anchor her to something solid. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. The deferential nurse from the break room, the one who'd apologized for correcting Dr. Caldwell's deadly mistake, was gone. What remained sounded like someone who'd made decisions in sandstorms while men bled out at her feet. How many? The SEAL commander stepped forward. He was broad across the shoulders with the kind of scar tissue around his eyes that comes from years of hard training. He'd seen things. So had she. He recognized it in her the way only another person marked by combat can. 32. His voice was quiet. 32 of us came home because you wouldn't leave that landing zone. You were outnumbered 4-1. Your entire medical team was down. You had 43 minutes of ammunition left and you spent every minute of it deciding who lived and who died, and you got all of us to the extraction point. He paused. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. 2 Purple Hearts. Each medal hit like a separate impact. Silver Star. The room registered that, whispers from the FBI agents who'd come prepared with exactly this moment. Bronze Star with Valor. Marcus's jaw tightened. His hand came up to his throat, the gesture automatic, the way soldiers touch their own pulse when they're trying not to break. 2 Purple Hearts. That meant she'd been hit. Hit twice. And she'd kept working. The Pentagon buried the entire operation, one of the FBI agents said. His name was Novak, and he held a folder stamped in colors that didn't exist in any civilian database. The insertion mission that Operation Copper Dawn was supposed to support went sideways in ways that couldn't be explained to Congress. Someone high enough to make decisions decided that if Operation Copper Dawn became public, the whole thing unraveled. So they erased it. They erased you. They told you to disappear into civilian life and never surface, or the consequences would reach your family. Laura looked at Marcus. Really looked at him. The weight of 8 years of believing his mother was dead had carved lines in his face that shouldn't have been there at 32. She had missed watching him graduate. Missed his commissioning. Missed the phone call where he would have told her he'd made lieutenant commander ahead of the normal promotion timeline. She had missed everything, because staying silent was the price of keeping him safe, even if he didn't know he was being protected. How did you find out? Her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, belonging to someone who'd learned to speak across impossible distances. Caldwell. Novak's expression was flat. Professional. When he tried to falsify your military personnel file to justify your termination, it triggered an automated alert with the Department of Defense. Attempted falsification of federal military records tied to a classified operation. The system flagged it before it even left the hospital network. We found him 2 hours ago trying to contact 3 board members to complete the documentation that would have destroyed your eligibility for any medical work in this country. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, a sound like insects trapped behind plastic, clicking and buzzing with barely contained voltage. Laura listened to that sound for what felt like a long time. In her mind, she was already walking out of this room and moving into the next part. The part where Caldwell would have to understand what he'd done. The part where the man who called her Nurse Nightingale, with venom dripping from every syllable, would finally see who he'd been trying to destroy. "He's in custody?" she asked. "Being escorted out now." One of the other agents, the one with the NCIS credential clipped to his belt, turned toward the door. "The entire hospital knows." Word spread fast. "Your colleagues are in the hallways." She didn't remember standing, but she was moving toward the door. Marcus reached for her shoulder and she felt his hand settle there, solid and present in a way that nothing had been solid for 8 years. The touch anchored her. The touch said, "I know who you are now." The hallway outside the administrator's office had filled with people the way crowds form at accident scenes, a magnetic draw toward something momentous happening. Nurses Laura had sat within breaks, who'd stopped sitting with her once Caldwell's campaign began. Orderlies who'd looked away when she walked past. The charge nurse who'd cried silently during the public humiliation in Hartley's room, who'd refused to meet Laura's eyes for weeks afterward because she knew what was happening and didn't have the rank to stop it. 2 FBI agents were walking Dr. Raymond Caldwell down that hallway. His face had gone white, not the white of shock, but the white of a man whose entire neural system was flooding with adrenaline and catastrophic understanding. He was still in his white coat. Still trying to project authority, except his hands had begun to shake. One of them kept reaching for his watch, checking the time as if he could reverse it, as if the next 3 minutes might be different from this one. "Dr. Caldwell, you have the right to remain silent," Agent Novak said, his voice carrying easily through the corridor. Not loud. Precise. The kind of official language that echoes in bones. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney. "This is insane," Caldwell said. His voice had cracked. The man who commanded every room through sheer force of will was trying to command this one and failing. "I was protecting patient safety." She was practicing medicine without a license. She was dangerous. "I was following protocol." Attempted falsification of federal military records, Novak continued, as if Caldwell hadn't spoken. Obstruction of a federal investigation. Conspiracy to commit fraud. You accessed Major Bennett sealed personnel file with restricted clearance, attempted to alter official documents to justify termination of a service member, and documented false performance records for the express purpose of destroying her civilian employment history. Caldwell looked directly at Laura as they walked past. His eyes held the kind of hatred that comes from sudden, complete powerlessness. "You did this," he said. "You walked in here with some military friend and you destroyed everything I built." "No." Laura's voice cut through the hallway like a scalpel. "You destroyed it. You just didn't know who you were destroying it for." They took him toward the elevators. The crowd parted like water around a stone, and nobody spoke, nobody moved, nobody did anything except watch. 48 hours ago, this man had wielded absolute authority. 48 hours ago, he'd had the board backing him, the administration defending him, the institutional weight of Sacred Heart behind every decision he made. Now he was walking toward federal charges while his colleagues watched in silence, and the silence was absolute. 6 months later, someone sent Laura a photograph. It arrived at her new office without a return address, just a manila envelope with her name printed in careful block letters. Inside was a Polaroid, the kind of instant film that had started yellowing at the edges before it was even developed. Caldwell was sitting at a folding table in a strip mall parking lot off Route 460, between a tax preparation service and a shuttered dry cleaner. A hand-painted banner hung behind him, supplemental insurance for active seniors. He'd aged a decade. His suit was the kind you bought off the rack at a department store going out of business sale. His face had the particular shade of gray that comes from losing everything in 6 months. Marcus called her that afternoon. He'd gotten a copy of the same photograph at his new duty station with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines out of Camp Lejeune. They didn't say much about it. They both understood the message. They both understood what it meant when the most powerful man in your professional world ended up alone in a parking lot with nothing but a folding table and the steady accumulation of small defeats. The board wants to retire his name from the hospital foundation, Marcus said. There was dry humor in his voice, the kind only combat-trained people understand. Want to guess what the statue's dedication is going to be? Laura didn't ask. She already knew. The east room of the White House was smaller than she'd expected. That was the first thing she noticed. Smaller than the photographs suggested. Brighter. The light came through windows the size of doorways, and it turned everything the color of gold leaf. She was standing in dress blues that fit her like they were made yesterday, even though they'd been carefully preserved in a cedar chest since the day the Pentagon ordered her to disappear. The medals were already heavy against her chest, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and the president hadn't even begun speaking yet. Marcus stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder the way it had been in the administrator's office, the way it had been throughout the 6 months of interviews and declassification and the slow process of making her existence official again. His uniform was dress blues too. His rank insignia showed lieutenant commander, the promotion he'd earned while his mother was invisible, while she was teaching wound care to residents who had no idea they were learning from the woman who'd trained Navy surgical teams under fire. The president spoke about Operation Copper Dawn. He used the words extraordinary valor and selfless service and sacrifice beyond measure. He talked about how the decision to bury that operation had been made in rooms she'd never seen by people she'd never know, but that decision had been wrong, and that sometimes a nation had to admit when it had made the wrong choice about someone. When it was her turn to speak, and somehow it was her turn, somehow the microphone was there and the room was quiet and every face was looking at her, Laura looked at the SEAL commander standing in the 3rd row. Looked at the 16 men beside him, all of them wearing uniforms, all of them alive because of 8 minutes in a landing zone and a woman who decided that her own survival was less important than theirs. I disappeared because I was ordered to, she said. Her voice was steady. The nurse had been buried as deep as the operation. What remained sounded like authority, like someone accustomed to making decisions when the options were all terrible and one of them had to be chosen anyway. I stayed quiet because I had no choice. I let people believe I was less than I was because the alternative would have endangered everyone I loved. But I want to tell you something about silence. Silence isn't weakness. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is the strongest thing you can do. Sometimes it's the only gift you have left to give. The room was absolutely quiet. When they left the White House that evening, Laura asked for a detour. She asked Marcus to drive her to Sacred Heart. The hospital was brighter at night than it should have been, lit up like an institution that refused to apologize for existing in the darkness. She walked through the doors and nobody stopped her. People recognized her, not as the nurse who'd been suspended, but as the person the hospital had been trying to erase. The looks on their faces held apology, recognition, the slow understanding that they'd been complicit in something terrible by not speaking up. She went to the floor where she'd worked for 3 years. The break room where people had stopped sitting when she arrived. The trauma bay where she'd packed a wound that nobody else could have packed and done it with meal tray plastic wrap and her own hands. The hallway where Dr. Caldwell had been walked past in handcuffs. The hospital board had offered her his old position. Director of surgery. All the authority he'd wielded, suddenly hers for the taking. She'd declined and created something different instead. A new role. Director of Trauma Services. Not about managing people through fear, but about teaching them to see what was in front of them. To trust their instincts. To speak up when protocol was wrong. Her first hire was the charge nurse who'd cried in the hallway. The one who'd watched the public humiliation and known she was seeing something unjust but hadn't had the power to stop it. Laura had found her 3 months after the declassification, working nights at a smaller hospital, the kind of place that takes people after they've been damaged by bigger institutions. Laura had walked into that break room and sat down across from her and said 4 words, "You get one chance differently." The charge nurse had understood immediately. She'd come back to Sacred Heart. She'd started training new residents on Laura's protocols. She'd helped rebuild the unit into something that worked because it was built on collaboration instead of fear. On Laura's office wall, she hung the faded unit patch, the one she'd sewn into her jacket lining all those years ago, the MacGuffin that had carried her identity through the long silence. Beside it, she hung a photograph of Marcus pinning on his new rank. Lieutenant Commander. The son of a disappeared major who'd learned to disappear too, and then learned to appear again. She spent her days on the floor now, teaching. A young resident was struggling with a wound that wouldn't pack properly, too much tissue damage, too much bleeding, too much uncertainty about what the anatomy underneath actually looked like. Laura stood beside her and walked her through it. Think like this, she said. Pressure first. Anatomy second. Your hands know more than you think they do. The resident looked at her with the kind of awe people have when they're watching someone do something that seems impossible and they're beginning to understand that impossible is just another word for trained. How did you learn all this? The resident asked. Laura smiled. It was a small smile. It held 8 years of silence in it. It held 32 Marines who'd come home. It held the slow unbowing of a woman who'd learned that the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Practice, she said. Years and years of practice in places you don't want to know about. If this story moved you, if you recognized something of yourself in Laura's quiet strength or in the decision to keep silent when speaking would have destroyed everything, subscribe to the channel. Like this video. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you really were? What would you have done in Laura's position? The quietest stories often hide the loudest truths. Stay with us for the next one.